Welcome tonight. So glad y'all are here. You are in for a treat. I'm not going to hold you long. It is Black History Month, February, and the person we're going to hear from in this class, in this book club, represents African-American history here in Sacramento, being the first African-American police chief. He's also my fraternity brother in Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, and he's my Christian brother. He is a member of this church, a good friend, a good family member of Midtown, and to me, he is also developing into a scholar of the history of how systems impact us across race and ethnicity in the state of California and beyond. So I can't think of anybody better to teach a class like this. Please welcome Daniel Hahn.
Thank you. Is this on? Oh, it's on. Look at that. Well, good evening. Man, you guys are some brave souls coming out in this weather. I was getting ready to leave my house, and all the power went out. So luckily, I knew how to open my garage door without power. So who knew what year that song was? What's the group? Black Eyed Peas. I don't know how many of you listen to the lyrics of that song, or you like me where I just make up lyrics to songs because I don't really understand what they said, so I'll be singing along, and my daughter's like, "What did you just say, Daddy? That's not what the song says." I'm like, "Well, that's what I've been singing for 20 years. But if you listen to the lyrics of that song, I would think that a lot of people here, if not everybody, think that those lyrics apply to today, even though it's 22 years old. So throughout the month, we might hear a couple songs, because I believe music, if you listen to music from different eras, you can tell what's going on in that era, because the music tells you the story of whatever that time is. So we might hear another song later tonight, too, about the era that Martin Luther King was talking about in the first chapter. So we're going to jump in. So as you probably know, this book that we're going over this month was the last book Martin Luther King wrote before he was assassinated in 1968. This came out in 1967. And so to me, this book is a history book that is told through the eyes of Martin Luther King, plus his philosophy and what he believed needed to be done. So I ask you a couple things. When we go over this over the next month, don't just think, Martin Luther King's talking a lot about the black community. He's talking about poverty. He talks about Native Americans, but a lot of it is the black community. So as we listen to what his philosophy was then, think about, does it apply to today? And don't just think of the African-American community today. Think about any community that you are involved with, know of, participate in, that doesn't have the power that maybe they need to make their tomorrow a better place, and apply Martin Luther King's philosophies to that, and think, does it apply? And if so, how would we do that today? So the other thing I'll say is we will talk a lot about history, and we're talking about some sensitive subjects. Every day I watch the news now, I hear about these sensitive subjects that we will be going over. So I just want to start with my philosophy on history. So I started studying history researching history probably about 13 years ago, and I'll continue to do it for the rest of my life. But I'll be the first to tell you, in high school and all the way through college, I have had no use of history. I thought, like, why are we looking backwards when we should be looking forwards? I don't care about cherry trees, wooden teeth, or any of those other things that we learned in school. I wish I could say history was the only class I had no use for in high school. There was probably a few other, like my other 5 classes, I probably had no use for either. But about 13 years ago, I started researching history for the reason of kind of teaching that to the command staff of the police department that I was leading at the time, to hopefully help us connect better with the underserved communities. And then I got addicted to the history and it started explaining so many things, and we'll get into that more in a little bit. So before we jump into the next slide, I just wanted to say that when we talk about history, to me, and I've seen it done so many different ways, some ways that turn me off is at the very beginning of a class. To me, history is not for the purpose of making people feel guilty, of blaming people. And that's for many reasons, but the primary reasons are none of us have a time machine that can take us back into history and to change anything. We can't change history. It's already written down. So to feel guilty about something that's already written down doesn't seem very useful to me. To me, the use of history that I've found useful is to understand how we got to where we're at today. Because only then can we start having real discussions and make real plans of how do we make tomorrow better for all people. For example, if you went to the doctor and you had high blood pressure, that doctor's, well, a good doctor, I should say, is not going to just prescribe you medication. They're going to ask you a ton of questions, right? They're going to ask you questions about your family. They're going to ask you questions about your parents. They're going to ask you all sorts of historical questions. Why? Because they're trying to get to the root cause of why you have high blood pressure to solve that. So same thing in our communities and our society. If we want to be able to make tomorrow better, we have to understand how we got here. That, to me, is the use of history. And so I'll add some extra history to explain what Martin Luther King was talking about. But if you read chapter 1, hopefully you did. If you didn't, that's fine. We're going over it tonight. You'll see he's mainly talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and how that started, what were the ramifications of that, what came after that. He talked about that. I think on page 2, right at the very beginning of the chapter, he talks about what came shortly after the signing of that bill. We still had riots. We still had protests throughout our country. And this bill was supposed to be like one to end all those, and he talks about, but they still occurred. He says on page 8, quote, "The grim evidence of its hold," he's talking about discrimination, "on white Americans is revealed in polls that indicate that 88% of them would object if their teenage children dated a Negro. About almost 80% would mind it if a close friend or a relative married a Negro, and 50% would not want a Negro as a mayor." Even though we signed all these bills and amendments that said everybody's equal, still the personal opinions are there's something wrong there. He talks about legislation that evaded or substantially nullified and unenforced is a mockery of the law. So even though we have these amendments, we have voting rights bills and all these things, there's still voting issues. And so that's kind of what chapter 1 is. How many people brought their book? All right, good. I'm going to ask some of y'all to read something for a second. But first, I wanted to do a little bit, introduce myself to you a little bit, just so you understand who's facilitating this over the next month, and hopefully throughout the month I'll get to meet each one of you. Let me make sure I remember how Daniel told me to. I'll never forget Daniel because my name's Daniel. So as it says up there, my name is Daniel Hahn. I wanted to go over a little bit of my personal history because my family side is what drives my core beliefs. I have all sorts of other experiences, but nothing shaped my core beliefs more than my family. So, and it is what makes me have hope for our future at all times. And you'll understand, hopefully, that in a second. So, my biological father was from Shreveport, Louisiana. He moved to West Oakland when he was about 15 years old. He went to McClamis High School in Oakland and was the first in his family to go to college. My biological mother, he was black. My biological mother was white, and she is from the Eureka area. They met in college at Humboldt State. Now, because they were my parents and because we're in church, I don't know how this happened, but somehow as they were dating, she became pregnant. I don't know how that works when it's your parents. And she secretly came to Sacramento and gave birth to me at Mercy Hospital. She did not tell her parents that she was pregnant, and she definitely didn't tell her parents that the father was black. Now, in my research, I found that maybe my maternal grandparents didn't too much care for people that looked like me, and that I would assume is part of the reason why she secretly came here. Now, remember, this is in the 60s. When I grew up, I didn't know any mixed-race children, right? It wasn't common like it is now. And so the miracle of this story are in these pictures that you see here. My mom was born and raised in a small town named Painesville, Minnesota. He ain't from Painesville, though, because nobody like him, looks like him is from Painesville. It was not a diverse city. I think the first time my mom ever saw a black person was when she was about 15 years old, when Rusk College, a historically black college from Mississippi, their choir was traveling across the country, and my grandmother invited them to the farmhouse. And this would have been in like the 1940s. So that's a miracle in and of itself. I don't know where my grandmother would have decided where our country was at the time to invite 20 or 30 African-American college students over to the house. My father is from, and she grew up there, went to University of Minnesota, and didn't move here until like 1966, somewhere around there. My father is from a small town in Nebraska. He probably did not see a black person until he joined the Navy. He fought in the Korean War. Got out of the military, the Navy, and went to the University of Wyoming, and they met after college. They had my brother and my sister. My brother's 5 years older than me. You can see him in this picture. He's the only well-behaved one in the family. Thank goodness my mom had at least one well-behaved child. He's 5 years older than me. My sister Martha is 4 years older than me. She was born with hydrocephalus. So she has significant physical and mental disabilities. And while they were living in Casper, Wyoming, my mom wanted 3 children. The doctor told her a third child would probably have disabilities because my sister was born with disabilities. And so she was reading a magazine at the time that was about adoption and the hardest children to place in families. And the hardest children were kids with disabilities. Well, she already had my sister, so she didn't want a child with disabilities. The second hardest children to place in the mid-60s were kids of mixed race. And she wanted to adopt a child that might not otherwise get adopted. And so they moved to Sacramento for my dad's job, and they adopt me in 1968. Now I still think about this today. How did these two come to adopt a black child growing up where they grew up, in the environment that they grew up? I still don't have the answer to that. It's like a miracle to me. But it flat out saved my life. Because if I hadn't got adopted and it was bouncing around from foster home to foster home, I surely wouldn't be standing in front of you today, and I surely wouldn't have had the benefits I had from my mom and the person she is. So unfortunately, my dad died when I was 5. Complications from Marfan syndrome. He died on the operating table at UC Davis Medical Center. And so now my mom is in a strange land, California, no family, 3 children, 1 with disabilities and 1 just a true knucklehead. That wouldn't be my brother. I was not a good student. I flunked the 4th grade. Even though I'd score in like the 90th percentile on the test, I'd get Fs. I loved school, I just didn't like doing the work. When I was 9 years old, I witnessed my first murder. We grew up in Oak Park, right at the corner of 33rd and 2nd Avenue. Coming home from church, my mom was the choir director, church organist for Oak Park United Church of Christ. I run home to watch the Raiders, the best football team in all the land. Okay, at least one intelligent person in the back. And we hear gunshots, my older brother and I, and we look out the window and we witness a guy get shot probably 10, 12 times in the middle of the street in front of our house. I run down the stairs, run across the street to the liquor store where he collapsed, and I stand over him and essentially watch him die at 9 years old. In middle school, I testified in Superior Court in a murder jury trial, as my brother and I were the only ones that witnessed it. My mom remarried when I was about 9 or 10. He died, my stepdad died when I was 16 of brain cancer. And now my mom has 5 children by herself, but she thought community was her family. And so I had many second moms, a few second fathers, and a whole community that helped raise. I always say my mom in Oak Park raised me. When I was 16, I was arrested by a Sacramento police officer for assault on an officer and resisting arrest in the living room of my home and taken to juvenile hall in handcuffs. When I was, I think on the video, if you saw the video, I said I accidentally joined the police department. When I was 18 years old, I applied to the police department after being harassed by recruiters in my class at City College, And the only reason I went through with it after saying no for so long was because it paid $5 an hour more than I was making at Florin Mall at 18 years old. I wish I could tell you I wanted to change the world and be of service and all these things my mom taught me. No, it was $5 an hour more. And then my plan was to quit the police department when I graduated from Sac State. But by then I was doing community work in the police department, and I fell in love with the work, and that turned into 34 years as a police officer, with the last 11 as a police chief in Roseville. I left to go to Roseville, and then I came back. In the meantime, when I was a young officer in 1992, my younger brother had just got out of the Army. He fought in Desert Storm. He was an Army Ranger for a little bit, but then he got addicted to drugs. And he was downtown at 19th and G, not too far from here, dealing drugs, using drugs, and a call came out at his house. It was my beat. I worked downtown. I responded to the call where he had been murdered by his drug dealing partner. So I had to call my mom on the little phone right by the Bank of America on 21st Street and tell my mom her youngest son had been murdered. And I say that story because as my whole career I've worked with people with drug problems and other issues. And when I think of my younger brother, I never think of the drug issues. We were the youngest, so we shared a room growing up. I think of him as a young kid. He wanted to be a veterinarian, but at some point he got on the wrong road. Right? At some point he became addicted to drugs, and it changed his whole path. If we were able to get him back on the right road, he'd be here today probably fixing one of your dogs or cats or horses or something like that. So I always have compassion because I had to call my mom, and I've only heard my mom cry probably 3 or 4 times in my life, and that was one of the times. And she knew he was a drug addict. She knew he dealt drugs. She despised drug dealers, but it was her son. So it doesn't really matter it's her son. And so I saw a lot of stuff growing up. And my mom is why I got through all of it and why I was able to do the things that I did. She was an amazing, amazing woman. Today, her house that she gave away for free, everything she's ever owned, she's given away for free. Her house is used to help rescue women from being trafficked. The very bedroom I grew up in is one of the rooms they give to women being trafficked as they're going through their program. And I'll end on this. Just the other day, a friend of mine texted me a picture of him and another guy standing next to each other and sent me a picture. And he says, "This dude says he knows your mom, or knew your mom." And I'm like, man, he looks familiar. He was a kid my mom used to work with on the corner down the street from her house after I had moved out. So I was in my 20s when this happened. But I remember her talking about this kid and meeting this kid. And he tells my buddy that my mom saved his life. So you think about she didn't just save my life. She saved a lot of people's lives. And if you look at this picture in the 60s, what was she thinking? Right? The caseworker and the adoption, the social workers, the caseworkers, I don't know if anybody in here is a social worker, but the caseworkers to this day, when you go to adopt, they research your family. They want to make sure that they're placing this child in a family that fits this child. The caseworker told my mom she shouldn't adopt me. It's her job to place me in a good family. And I'll let you guess why she said that in the 1960s. She said, "Why do you want to adopt a black boy? You should want to adopt a white child because she's white. Not only that, but you should want to adopt a girl, a blonde-haired, curly-haired girl, white girl." And my mom's like, "Why?" She goes, "Because she won't keep your name." Meaning when she gets married, she'll take her husband's name and she won't be a Hahn. When I got a little bit older, starting as far as back as I can remember, when I was about 8 or 9, people would come up, leaders would come up and talk to my mom and basically tell her she should be ashamed of herself adopting a black child because she's white. And there's no way a white woman could raise a black son. And I'd be like, "I'm right here, dude. I'm standing right here. You telling my mom she shouldn't adopt?" What? And I never said anything because I didn't want my mom to backhand me. But it was weird to me because my biological mother is white. So if I had grown up with my biological mother, I would have grown up with a white mom. Yet they were telling my mom, who is white, that she shouldn't have adopted a black son. And this is why I say I talk to adoption groups all the time. A child doesn't care about color. A child cares about love. and I had that. My mom believed I could do anything under the sun way more than I ever did in myself. My mom saved my life because she did a selfless act that was not necessarily super common in the 60s and didn't care about all those other things. She did a lot of what Martin Luther King is asking for in this book. So let's do this. Whoever has a book, if I get a volunteer, let me turn to the page. See all these little markers I have on my page? Looks like Pastor Ephraim's Bible. If somebody could go to the page 1, the last sentence on page 1 through the first paragraph of page 2. I got any volunteers to read that? We got a microphone? Volunteer? Here? All right, right here. The last sentence that starts with, he pledged that we.
We shall overcome. Declared that the national government.
I forgot who raised their hand. I'm sorry.
Okay, all right. I'm that guy.
I'm that guy.
Okay, it says, we shall overcome, declare that the national government, next page. How far am I reading?
Through that first paragraph.
Oh, through the first paragraph,
Yeah.
okay. Must be law ensure to every Negro has full rights as a citizen. The Voting Rights Bill of 1965 was the result. In signing the measure, the president announced that today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield. Today we strike away the last major shackle of fierce and ancient bonds.
So what Martin Luther King is talking about is what President Lyndon Johnson said in the rotunda of our nation's capital when he actually signed the 1965 Voting Rights Bill. I want to read you the full quote from the president's speech, not the whole speech, but the quote that pertains to that. He said, "Today is a triumph for freedom, as huge as any victory that has ever been won on any battlefield. Yet to seize the meaning of this day, we must recall darker times. 3.5 centuries ago, the first Negroes arrived in Jamestown. They did not arrive in brave ships in search of a home for freedom. They did not mingle fear and joy in expectation that in this new world, anything would be possible to a man strong enough to reach for it. They came in darkness and they came in chains. And today we strike away the last major shackle of those fierce and ancient bonds. Today the Negro story and the American story fuse and blend." So let me ask you this. What do you think the president meant by we strike away the last major shackle? What do you think he meant by that? Yes?
He thought that once we can ensure everyone vote, all is solved.
All is solved. Somebody had their hand. Would you agree with that? Yes. I would agree. So, this is what, 60-some years later after he said that? Do you think he was right? Was that the last major shackle? Is everything cool now? No? Okay. So maybe President Johnson was wrong. If you turn to page 5, end of the first paragraph, Martin Luther King writes, "Laws are passed in a crisis mood after a Birmingham or a Selma, but no substantial fervor survives the formal signing of legislation. The recording of the law in itself is treated as the reality of reform." So what he's talking about is we sign these things. I usually say in my classes, it's just ink on a piece of paper, right? Just because I write something down doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? So Martin Luther King is saying that we in this country, when we write it down, we think it's accomplished. When he's basically saying, no, that's just the first step. There's more steps to come. As a matter of fact, before, and these should be on the emails you got. I put both of these, both the speech at the signing in August of 1965 and when President Johnson addresses Congress trying to urge them to put a voting rights bill forward and vote on it and give it to him for his signature. So that was on March 15th of 1965, he addresses Congress. And in that address, he says, "It is more than 100 years ago that Abraham Lincoln, a great president of another party, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But emancipation is a proclamation and not a fact." So when he says we're going to remove the last major shackles a few months later when he signs the bill, he's basically saying he emancipated everybody, but this is like the last step before people are truly emancipated. So let me ask you this. If you just closed your eyes for a second and you put yourself in the shoes of a slave in 1865 when the Civil War was over, and you know the Emancipation Proclamation has been signed and now you're free, what do you think you would have thought that meant? What do you think if you were a slave for your whole life at that point? What do you think you would have thought emancipation means to you? You're free in all sorts, right? Which is literally what the 13th Amendment said. I think we'll find that some of that is not necessarily true. Before I go to the next slide, it's important to understand what comes before these great moments in our history and what came after. So what came before, literally a week before, President Lyndon Johnson addresses Congress and urges them to put a voting rights bill forward. Martin Luther King and many other people have been fighting for this for a long time, but it didn't happen until March of 1965 when Lyndon Johnson addressed Congress. Well, a week before that address, Bloody Sunday occurred. Does everybody remember what Bloody Sunday was? John Lewis and people that came across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to do that 55-mile march for voting rights. And Sheriff Jim Clark deputized a bunch of people and hit people with nightsticks, gassed people, and did all sorts of things, but it was on the national news. So the country saw all this for really the first time and was appalled. And that was the last step to get Lyndon Johnson to do this. And you'll see this repeated throughout time of people kind of needing to be pushed. So, I told you, wrong way. We talked about Abraham Lincoln. We talked about, these are the two, the bottom one is in the rotunda at the signing. You read that, and I read the one on the top where he addresses Congress. I put both of those speeches in the email that you could have got, so if you wanted to read all of it, it's in there. So I wanted to address a little bit about Abraham Lincoln because my wife is a fifth grade school teacher. Anybody in here have a relative that's in education? Okay. Hopefully that's not you, but a relative. Let me see if my experiences are the same as yours. Do you frequently get told? I get told. Maybe it's a relative that has to ask you, because mine is my wife, and so I get told. That have you ever been told that you have to go to the classroom before the semester starts to help set up the classroom? Raise your hand if that's, okay, good. We have similar experiences. So last year, I was in the class drilling holes in the wall, asking my wife, "You sure it's okay to drill holes in here?" To hang curtains over her windows. Her classroom looks like the living room of your house. And I look over at the wall, and there's two pictures about this size on the wall of two presidents. Same two presidents that were that size on the wall of my elementary school. Who can tell me which two presidents that was? Washington and Lincoln. Anybody have a different experience than that, than Washington and Lincoln? Same two presidents. So now I'm immediately disgusted. Like, how come all the presidents aren't there? Why just those two? And she proceeds to tell me, well, the package I bought has those two big ones, and then it has that other poster with all the presidents on it, but they're like wallet size. And I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So when I was growing up, everybody had their favorite president, and it was either Washington or Lincoln. Mine was Lincoln. He's the only one I know other than the current presidents that I could tell you what number president he was. He was number 16. And yes, in case any of you go, dang, he's pretty stupid if he doesn't know Washington's number. I do know Washington's number. And I like Lincoln because he freed the slaves. I'm black. He freed the slaves. That's my man. But Lincoln wasn't much different than most other people at the time. Let me read you a speech, not the whole thing, a portion of a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave when he was running for Congress in 1858 against Stephen A. Douglas before he ran for president. He said these same things in his inauguration address and many other speeches he gave throughout his lifetime. Quote, "I will say then that I am not now nor have ever been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not now nor have ever been in favor of making voters or jurors out of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races of living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. And I am, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. I say upon this occasion, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. I do not understand that because I do not want a Negro woman for a slave, I must necessarily want her for a wife." Anybody ever hear those words from Abraham Lincoln before? 2, maybe 3, 4. I'll tell you what I didn't hear about that is in elementary school, high school, or college. Never heard any of that. So basically, Abraham Lincoln didn't agree with slavery. That's too far. But he did not think black people were equal to white people, just like most of the people didn't. Why? Because that's what we were taught. That's what we were taught. So he talks about voters. He didn't think black people should be able to vote. It was over 100 years later, 1965, that black people were truly able to freely vote, amongst other people, Chinese, Japanese, Native American, women, couldn't vote. The other thing he says in here is black people should not be able to intermarry. Anybody know that was against the law in our country? Anybody, raise your hand if you knew that was against the law in California. Not in Alabama, California. What year did that law change in California? Does anybody know? It was against the law. It wasn't very long before I was born to a black man and a white woman. No, it was before that. 1948, Mrs. Perez, a Hispanic woman, because Hispanic people checked the white box because there was no Hispanic box yet, and she tried to Miss Perez tried to marry Sylvester Davis. They worked together in Los Angeles. They went to the county clerk's office to get their marriage certificate, and he denied them because he was black. They fought it to the California Supreme Court, and in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled it was a violation of the 14th Amendment and did away with those laws in California. It's 1948. So I don't know if anybody in here was alive. I wasn't alive, but my mom was very much alive in 1948. So almost 100 years later, our country still didn't believe much different than what Abraham Lincoln said in his speeches. So when we talk about a lot of this history, we think it's a long time ago, maybe all in the South and not in where we live. So let's real quickly go over this. These are the amendments. They were called the Reconstruction Amendments, which is the time right after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except for as punishment for a crime. That still is in the amendment today. Whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States. In other words, slavery is done unless you are convicted of a crime, then we can basically sort of treat you like a slave. And we did just that with black codes and convict leasing. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. We still talking about that today, right? That's a big topic today. The 15th Amendment prohibits the federal government and states denying citizens the right to vote or on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That was in 1870. Why do we need a Voting Rights Act in 1965 if we had the 15th Amendment? It says right there that we can vote. Yep. So in the 14th Amendment, one of our, even with the voting, a lot of these voting rights bills that happened over time, still, even when a lot of people gained the right to vote, still a lot of Native Americans still didn't have the right to vote. For example, Michigan Senator Jacob Howard, with the last amendment you see on the screen, he was quoted as saying, quote, "I am not yet," and listen to the language he uses and how it reinforces stereotypes that that have persisted in our country. Michigan Senator Jacob Howell said, quote, "I am not yet prepared to pass a sweeping act of naturalization by which the Indian savages, wild or tame, belonging to a tribal relation, are to become my fellow citizens and go to the polls and vote with me." That was a congressman that said that, right? Wild savages. How are we going to let some wild savages vote? The 24th Amendment, passed in 1964, prohibits poll taxes in federal elections, but didn't prohibit poll taxes in state elections or local elections. So if you're voting for the president, you can't have a poll tax. But if you're voting for mayor, you can have a poll tax. So I just wanted to give you an example. You probably can't read it because I can barely read it up here. But these are some of the questions. This is in 1968. Alabama had a literacy test. And these are the questions. Yell out if you can answer any of these questions. Everybody in here has probably, hopefully, voted probably multiple times. See if you can answer any of these questions. Which of the following is a right guaranteed by the Bill of Rights? Public education, employment, trial by jury, or voting? Trial by jury, does everybody agree with that? Or some people are like, because I read that, I'm like, ooh, shoot, I don't know. The federal census of population is taken every 5 years, true or false? Okay. I'll give you both two. If a person is indicted for a crime, name two rights which he has. A U.S. senator elected at the general election in November takes office the following year on what date? Anybody know that one? This is the literacy test. And the way literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clause. Does everybody know what a grandfather clause is? If your grandfather voted, then you can vote. So who didn't vote in slavery times? Slaves. So now I'm free. I go to vote. Did your grandfather vote? Well, no, he couldn't vote. He was like, what? Go away. Poll taxes, you had to pay to vote. And literacy tests where you passed the test. The problem is each registrar controlled it. It wasn't centrally controlled. So they decided who passed and who didn't. You see the bottom on this? Who was the president of the Constitutional Convention, and what kind of suit was he wearing? That was one of the questions the African-American hopeful voter got asked. He didn't pass. He couldn't vote. So in this chapter, Martin Luther King talks about these uprisings that happened after the last major shackle was removed. Right? One of these uprisings was the law. Well, let's start with Watts, because this August 11th is about a week after President Johnson actually signed the Voting Rights Act into law. It happened because two brothers were driving a car. The driver was most likely drunk. Even his mom got mad at him because he was drinking. He gets pulled over by the California Highway Patrol. And the one brother runs home, gets his mom. The mom comes, a little disturbance happens. Pretty soon there's a physical altercation with the crowd. And soon after that, a rumor starts that the police department beat up a pregnant woman, which turned out to be false. But you know how rumors get going. And all heck broke loose. Martin Luther King and all sorts of leaders went to Watts to try to keep people calm. Eventually, the riot had to be quelled with 4,000 Army National Guard. There are 34 deaths, $40 million in property damage, similar to what we've experienced over the last 5 or 6 years in various cities. The National Guard was here in Sacramento for the protests that were going on here, protecting property and things like that. But what you might not know is the McCone Commission was commissioned by Pat Brown, which is Jerry Brown's dad when he was governor. And they were tasked with looking at the causes of the riots and some solutions to the Watts riots. This is what the McCone Commission said. They said that the riots were caused by high unemployment, poor schools, and related inferior living conditions that were endured by African Americans in Watts. Do those conditions still exist in many of our communities? Are those still the root causes of a lot of the protests that we see today? Yes. 2 years later, the long, hot summer where 150 riots across the country broke out. I have some stats, actually, on at least two of them. One in New Jersey. In Newark, some 26 people were killed, more than 700 were injured, and more than 1,000 people were arrested. $10 million, which is the equivalent of $91 million today, in property damage. The Kerner Commission, commissioned by the President of the United States, to look at the cause of the riots across our country, the over 150 riots that broke out in cities across our country. They said the cause was pervasive discrimination and segregation. I thought we had some amendments to the Constitution that did away with those things. The result of black frustration, lack of economic opportunity, and the manner that people were treated by white society, especially the police. Martin Luther King, when the Kerner Commission came out, Martin Luther King was quoted as saying that the report was, quote, warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. Their recommendation was end segregation, create new jobs, new housing construction, changes to the welfare program, and diversify police and media. Does that sound like it would apply to today? We still talk about some of those same things today? We've been told numerous times before. So, with that being said, we're going to go to our tabletop exercise. But if you listen to Martin Luther King in this chapter and throughout the book, and we'll talk about this in future classes that he talks about, but the whole nonviolence movement and all that, none of it was to divide. It was all to bring us together. All of it. And so like the whole time I worked as a police chief, that was my philosophy, right? And I got a lot of that from Martin Luther King. Like, divided, we don't do anything. We come together with all of our differences, all of our diversity, but if we come together, we can get somewhere. But we hear a lot today about dividing on all sides, right? A lot about dividing. And so what I wanted to do the tabletops will take, 15, 20 minutes at your table to discuss these questions. So first, show you what page this is on. This is on page 22. So, he writes, freedom is not won by a passive acceptance of suffering. Do you agree with that? Freedom is not won by a passive acceptance of suffering. I can tell you for a while I was police captain. For most of my career, I worked in Del Paso Heights, Manners, Del Paso Heights, for those of you familiar with the North area. And the first thing I did as a captain is call all the leaders in Del Paso Heights, and long story short, I put stats up on the board. And what I always heard when we would talk about things from people in that community, they would say, this is the Heights. It's just the way it is. I said, until that changes, we're not going to change our neighborhood. That's what he's talking about by a passive acceptance of suffering, right? It's just the way it is. Unless I move out of this neighborhood, this is the way it's going to be. It doesn't have to be that way. Freedom is won by a struggle against suffering. By this measure, Negroes, but in our case, just think of anybody that lacks the power that they need to improve their future. Negroes have not yet paid the full price of freedom. And whites, just think about people who do have the power, the lawmakers, whoever's in power. The whites have not yet suffered the full cost of justice. What he's referring about when he's talking about the black community is that he says in all these efforts to gain rights, everybody agrees, but only a small portion of people actually do the work. And he says we need all the people to do the work. As a matter of fact, on page 21, he says, quote, "No great victories are won in a war for the transformation of a whole people without total participation." On page 22, he says, "Violence has already been practiced too often and always because remedies were postponed." Meaning we tried it this nonviolent way and we're still in the same circumstances, so now we're burning the city down. So, and on the people in power, in his paragraph, he says the white folks, that they need to rise up against their own municipal, state, and federal government and make changes. He says, quote, "If he reserves his resentment," he's talking about those in power, "if he reserves his resentment only for the Negro, he will be the victim by allowing those who have the greatest culpability to evade responsibility." I hear this all the time when just the latest discussions right now on the pardons of the January 6th people that were arrested. And I hear frequently, yeah, but in all those protests, people, I'm like, can we stay on one subject at a time? Like you referring to protests 2 years earlier, let's stick on one subject. And so what Martin Luther King is saying is these frustrated groups, and it could be any group today, these frustrated groups that are now so frustrated that they're rioting in the street or burning buildings down, if all you do is take your anger out on them and ignore the other issues going on, then we're going to continue to be victims. So here's the question. That's the page. If you need to read it again at your table, discuss a couple things. Is this still true today? And by true, I mean that the people without the power, the people that don't have hope, the people that are struggling, the impoverished, whatever group you have in your mind that you're associated with, have not yet paid the full price of freedom? Is that true? And are those in power, the people that have the power to make decisions and make changes, they have not yet faced the full cost of justice? So the first question is, are those two things true? Discuss that at your table. And then what does it mean to not have won by passive acceptance? What does it mean by passive acceptance of suffering? So we just kind of talked about that. But more so, what is the full price of freedom today? What needs to be paid as the full price of freedom? And then for those in power, what is the full cost of justice for those who have it? So what does that mean today? So take a couple minutes and discuss those last two questions at your table, and then we'll ask for some volunteers to summarize your discussion. Okay, before we get to some reporting out, I just wanted to give a little bit more context to some of the things that Martin Luther King said. Remember, we talked about grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests when it came to voting. Even though the amendment said that all people should be able to vote, this is how we got away with doing these things. So people did fight those things like literacy tests, poll taxes, to all the way, in some cases, all the way to the Supreme Court. But the people that wanted to eliminate certain groups from voting, what they said is this is not a poll tax, a grandfather clause, the literacy tests are not based on race. They're based on literacy, they're based on who your grandfather is, and they're based on whether you could read or write. They don't have anything to do with race, and then the Supreme Court would uphold that. Okay, then go ahead and keep doing it. Somebody in here, when I asked you when people could get married, the black person could marry a white person in California. It was 1948, but somebody mentioned the Loving case. I think it was somebody at this middle table here. Yeah. So in case you don't know what that is, there is a movie, I think it's called The Lovings, that depicts this story. But Mildred and Richard Loving, Richard was a white man and Mildred was a black woman, lived in Virginia. They went to D.C., got married, and then they came back to Virginia. It was against the law in Virginia. The police department kicked in their door in the middle of the night while they were asleep in bed and arrested them because it was against the law, not only to be married, but to have relations, that thing that I didn't understand how my mom and dad did. And arrested them, and they were convicted. And they were sentenced to a year in prison for simply because the color of their skin and getting married. And the judge told them, I will suspend your sentence if you leave the state of Virginia and never come back together, like as a union. So they moved to Washington, D.C. They came back to Virginia and fought their case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1967, the Supreme Court ruled that laws like that are against the law in the entire country. 1967. So think about how many of us were alive. That was a year before my mom and dad gave birth to me. So, and I'm half black and half white. And that wasn't very long ago. So even though our Constitution, our amendments say certain things, people that if we haven't done anything other than write it on a piece of paper, people continue to find a new way of doing things. I mentioned the 13th Amendment says slavery is against the law unless you've been convicted of a crime. Guess what we did? We created new laws for a certain group of people. We convicted them of a crime, and we put them into convict leasing, a new form of slavery, because we didn't address anything other than writing it on a piece of paper. So with that, any volunteers for your table? Just kind of a summary of like these last two questions. What is the full price of freedom today for people like in the lower group that doesn't have the rights that they want or the power that they want or have hope? And then also, what is the full cost of justice for those who do have power and do have hope and all those things? Any volunteers? Gotta be at least one or two. Yes.
Okay. Something I found really interesting was on page 6, where in terms of a cost, it's a literal number. So it's in the middle paragraph of page 6. It says, the Assistant Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, Hyman Bookbinder, in a frank statement on December 29th, 1966, declared that the long-range cost of adequately implementing programs to fight poverty, ignorance, and slums will reach $1 trillion. He was not awed or dismayed by this prospect, but instead pointed out that the growth of the gross national product during the same period makes this expenditure comfortably possible. It is, he said, as simple as this: the poor can stop being poor if the rich are willing to become even richer at a slower rate. And I think that makes a lot of sense today.
Anybody else? Yes, down here in the front.
I'd just like to add something to question 1. What does it mean today, not won by passive acceptance of suffering? So today, as you mentioned, Chief Hahn, back with the Bloody Sunday, that was the first time the nation had saw suffering of that level to African Americans. But today, with social media, everyone has TVs. We see things every day to where it's sort of become desensitized across the nation. And so we think that that's sort of the passive acceptance of suffering today is seen through social media. For instance, with the Black Lives Matter movement, people are posting like the black screens on their Instagram, things like that. But and sort of leaching into question 2, those were sort of symbolic acts, and they weren't necessarily the acts of work that were needed to go out and actually make change. We talked about like levels of effort. You had that's the lowest level of effort is just making a post. The second level would be probably going out and marching, and the highest level would actually be either contributing like financially to something or going out and actually, participating in your community to actually make those changes. So that's sort of what we talked about on those 2.
Yeah, and we'll when in some of the future chapters, Martin Luther King talks about urban renewal and things like that. So we'll talk about what that meant for Sacramento, what he's referring to. But for example, I was just telling this to somebody earlier today. When I grew up in Oak Park, I grew up in Oak Park in the 70s and 80s. And latter part of that was the crack epidemic where things got exponentially even worse than they already were. I always thought Oak Park was always like that. I loved growing up. I had a blast growing up. But I always thought Oak Park was like that, and therefore I always thought it would be. And when I talk to people about, in our community, like Oak Park, Del Paso Heights, Meadowview, and the conversation comes up about why those neighborhoods are like that, right? Impoverished, education levels are lower, crime, things like that. The answer I get, I can't ever recall getting a different answer, always surround the causes, the people that live there. There's no fathers in the home. They need to get a job. They're just violent. But if you know the history of every one of those communities, that's not why those communities are like that. So if you think the cause is the actual people that live there and that they're just deficient in some form, like the daddies don't stick around, they're just violent people by nature, and all these things, think about what your potential solutions would be. Like arrests and convictions look pretty good in that example. But if the cause is taking economic vitality and other things out of those neighborhoods, which is the true history, then the solution is something totally different. And it's totally based on what you know as the cause of those issues. That's, to me, why history is so important. So, yeah.
I think along the lines of what the brother said over there is that I pulled out that one part in page 6, that the poor can stop being poor if the rich are willing to become even richer at a slower rate. At our table, we talked about to get into that question about what is the full price for freedom and what is the full cost of justice, both together, is how much of your own privilege are you willing to give up? Because there's tons of, there's times when we get to a place and we see injustices around us, but it don't necessarily affect me. So how much am I willing to give up for the freedom of others, for the justice of others? Or am I going to accept this crumb that I'm given because it's okay for me and my family, but at the risk of everything else, at the risk of justice and history and the future of us? So how much of our privilege are we willing to give up for the sake of justice?
And isn't that one of the primary reasons, one of the multiple primary reasons why we didn't want certain groups to vote, right? Because they might vote against my interests. They might vote against me. So therefore, I don't want them to vote or have a full vote or those sort of things. Absolutely. Any other table want to go? Yes.
Can you hear me? All right. Looking at the last two questions.
I don't think it's on.
Placing those together, the full price for freedom.
Yeah, hold on, let them switch you out.
All right. Are we better now? There we go. All right. So for those last two questions, full price for freedom, full cost of justice, I see those questions one and the same, and they have no exact numerical value. I think when the needs of humanity are equalized, and we talked about it, I think that's when both of those, the price and the cost, will receive those things. And sadly, I think through history, many times full freedom or full cost of justice is received when humans are on the brink of destruction. It's only when we seem to come together and give each other justice and that freedom we want and need. So we have to sadly experience a fire to come together and see how we should be treating each other, because we want the common necessities of life. We have to experience hurricanes and all these disasters to finally come together and see we are the same. So that's my 2 cents.
Good point. Well, who are some of the people that, some of this is changing, and I don't know, we probably have some various different opinions in here, but what large group of people oftentimes can't vote that are adults, I'm not talking about underage people, in our country today? What can take your right away, your voting right away? Felons, right? If you were convicted of a felony, you can't not only vote while you're incarcerated, but you can't ever vote again. Now, some of that's changing. That's starting to change around the country. Now, me personally, I've never really understood that. Like, even if I thought, okay, you can't vote while you're incarcerated, when you get out, you're using the streets, you're using the buses, you're using public whatever. Like, how come you can't vote? Aren't you using these things? And so, and then think about why. I can tell you the original reason why we came up with those rules that people convicted of felonies couldn't vote is our belief that they were less than kind of human, like they were immoral people. So we don't want immoral people to vote. The second reason was we thought that, first of all, not anymore. I think it's based off your driver's license now. Matter of fact, I got called for jury duty like 2 weeks ago. They rejected me, by the way. But back in the day, you were selected by jury duty by the voting rolls. So if you can't vote because you were convicted of a felony, then therefore you can't be on a jury. And if that number rises to a certain level, are we really tried by a jury of our peers? Right? If a whole segment of people can no longer vote and therefore be on juries and things like that. So, you think about, well, why didn't we? Well, we thought that people that were convicted of crimes would be too sympathetic to people that were arrested for a crime, right? So if they're on the jury, that's okay to kill people because I killed people or I robbed a store. And the reality is, I don't know. I have a bunch of friends I grew up with that went to prison. They're the ones that are still alive are in their 50s, so they're all doing great now. They're all out and everything. And then I've met people in my adult life that had did significant. The one thing that is common that runs through all of them, they're way more strict than I am. I talked to them about some case. They're like, lock that dude up. I'm like, man, were people wrong about these cats are more serious than I am. They're less forgiving than I am. So, any other tables? Yes.
Hello. One of the things that, so my brother Steve here brought up that same quote on page 6. And then we had a good discussion about how there's like macro aspects of ways of thinking collectively pertaining to like economic ways that then make the micro people, on the micro level, thinking of things that they don't want to give up. So one of the things, like in order for somebody to win, we have to be willing to give up something. But a lot of times people are not willing to do that. So one of the full costs of justice would be to we update our phones all the time. When's the last time that we update the ways that we think about things? So that's one of the things that we were talking about that would be needed to have true justice and true freedom.
Yeah. Good. All right, awesome. So just so you know, as we go through this, I'd love for you to be thinking about what you individually and what we collectively as a church can do to help our society and whatever groups are in this kind of scenario that Martin Luther King is talking about throughout this book, and what can we do to make tomorrow better for all people. So just kind of be thinking about that as we go through the next 3 weeks on what we individually and what we collectively as a church can do in today's time, and if Martin Luther King's philosophies further that. Last thing before we watch this quick video and then bring Pastor Bob up to close us out. Martin Luther King was one of the bigger proponents of nonviolent movement. And the whole nonviolent movement, the whole purpose was to bring people together. That was the purpose of the nonviolent. They had steps to it, right? First we go tell you we don't want to sit in the back of the bus anymore. We want to be able to sit wherever we want just like everybody else. And when they say no, then you go to the next step. And eventually, like the second or third step is, okay, now we're going to take action. We're going to stop shopping in your stores. If we can't come through the front door, then we're going to stop buying your product. We're going to stop riding on your bus if we can't sit wherever we want. And the whole purpose of that, though, is to bring you to the table, and let's talk about how we make tomorrow better for all people. That was the whole purpose of the nonviolent movement, was to bring people together, even if it kind of forced them at first, because you're going to go out of business if you don't come together and meet with us. And it was actually very successful, as Martin Luther King will cover in some of these latest chapters. Okay, so I wanted to play a quick video. Again, I said that if we listen to music from different times, it will really tell us what was going on at that time. So some of us might have been alive in the 60s, some of us might not. So if you feel comfortable, just close your eyes and listen to the song, and especially the lyrics. I think what you'll see is pain and suffering, but a hope a never-ending hope that tomorrow will be better. So this is Sam Cooke's song, Change is Gonna Come, from, anybody remember what year? It's the same year, not the same year, but the same time period that Martin Luther King's talking about in chapter 1. Anybody know what year? 61, 62, 64. 1964, so the year before the Voting Rights Act was signed that Martin Luther King talks about. So if you're comfortable, just close your eyes and listen, transport yourself back to 1964. Some of us might be able to literally transport ourselves back tonight. Not me, I wasn't born. Bob probably was born tonight. Yeah. There you go. I don't know if he's listening to the song at 2 months old, but he probably was, he just doesn't remember. Go ahead, Daniel.
Like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. Don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. I go to the movie and I go downtown. Somebody keep telling me don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Then I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Oh, there've been times that I thought I could last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.
He still had hope. I know I still have hope. And I think, people like my mom changed, you probably never heard of her unless you grew up in Oak Park, but she changed numerous lives. We all can do that. So again, as we go through this month, be thinking about how we individually can make a difference and how we collectively as a church can. So thank you for coming out on this dreadful, dreadful night. And I'll turn it over to Pastor Bob.
Can we give it up for Chief Hahn? Every chance that I get, I always, want to make sure publicly I thank Chief Hahn for doing all that he did for our city and becoming police chief at a time when we desperately needed him to be police chief. So, brother, we are, eternally indebted to you. I've heard Chief Hahn teach this stuff in different settings, and I have to tell you, like, please be here over the next few weeks. The stuff he's going to go over is so important, and I've actually heard him teach it to people who really didn't want to hear it, and he really made impact with them. He's done that over and over again. So you guys can help us. I want to thank you all for being here and caring enough about these issues to be here tonight. You guys can help us by just kind of word of mouth, talking to others and getting others here that really either should be here or need to be here. We'd love to see them here. So thank you guys. You mind if I close in prayer? Is that cool? Let's close. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you. We're so grateful again for everyone here tonight and for just the people of our congregation. So grateful that this kind of stuff matters. And it's so important because the things that Chief is going to go over here in the next couple weeks, they're things that people can glean from for what we're going through now. It is so directly applicable. So, Lord, just we pray that as many as you want here are here. We're, again, grateful for Chief Hahn. Thank you. Let us be safe and brave through the cold and through the storm. And until next time, Lord, keep us. We said this a prayer that's not by might or by strength, but through your Spirit. In Jesus' name, all of God's people said, amen. You guys have a good night and be careful.